My name is Michael Kerman, Leading Edge Seminars, and I'm really quite excited about welcoming you to this 1 hour session with Kate Truitt. So, along with Emily Porter, who you see on the screen, uh, who will be taking your questions and handling things in the background, the format will be as follows. I will be interviewing Kate for the first half hour or so. We'll talk about her book and other things. And if you have at any point questions you'd like to ask Kate, there'll be two ways of reaching Emily and then Kate. One, if you want to write a question in the chat box, please do that. Or if you want to put in the chat box, I'd like to talk to Kate directly on the Zoom screen. She'll be very happy to talk to you face to face with everyone else here. Also, we are recording this and we will send you a copy of this video in the next day or two. And it's yours if you need to want to review anything, if you want to forward it to a friend or colleague, that's what it's for. So you'll be getting that. Finally, we're very happy to let you know that Kate will be doing two webinars with us in the fall, one in September, one in December, and we'll send you that information on the email that we send you. So please look for that coming from Emily. So I have a couple of introductions. The first will be the more standard introduction of a speaker, and then an introduction based on my reading of Keep Breathing. So if you don't know Kate, Dr. Kate Truitt is a licensed clinical psychologist. She's an applied neuroscientist, and she holds an MBA in healthcare administration. She is an internationally recognized expert in the neuroscience of trauma, stress, and resilience, as well as the complex interplay amongst the three. She's dedicated her life to advancing the treatment of trauma and stress-related disorders. She lives in the Los Angeles area, where she leads her flagship group practice and clinic called appropriately Dr. Kate Truitt and Associates, and she serves as CEO for the Amy Research Foundation, a nonprofit focused on advancing the role of brain science in psychotherapy. And she is the author of two books. The first being Healing in Your Hands, Self-Havening Practices to Harness Neuroplasticity, Heal Traumatic Stress, and Build Resilience. And then the book we're going to be talking about today, Keep Breathing. It just came out pretty recently. Hey, I'll show it to you, what it looks like. Maybe that's not clear. And it's called Keep Breathing, a Psychologist's Intimate Journey Through Loss, Trauma, and Rediscovering Life. Well, first, what I want to say that this is truly a brave and remarkable book where Kate uses herself as the case example. It reads more like parts of it more like an intimate memoir. And if you are ever part of the discussion about self-disclosure in psychotherapy, Kate has gone the distance in using herself and her experiences really to teach. You know, it's not like here I am, it's like learn from my experience. Her honesty and openness is really very breathtaking. She begins with the devastating loss of her fiance a week before their wedding, and later shares stories from her life, from childhood, PTSD, serious medical problems and issues, to issues around relationships and resuming relationships after loss. She brilliantly weaves together this personal loss and trauma with explanations of the underlying neuroscience. So there's a lot therapists can learn about doing therapy as well as life. And Kate, my first question to you, and first, welcome to the screen. I'm so happy to see you again. You were here when we were doing webinars, when everyone was cooped up with COVID.
2020, yeah.
Yeah. So I'd like to ask you about the courage to write this book and the doubt you might have had in writing the book, because it's really a remarkable book.
Oh, thank you. And you know, we're taught in psychotherapy to hide ourselves behind a veil. And there's really good and important reasons for that. And I had a moment where which I don't write about in the book, and I had one of those devastating experiences where I had a client who actually stalked me and tried to take my life. And when that happened, it was this reckoning for myself of saying, you know, this is just one more tipping point in my oddball story of how trauma continually intrudes in my life as a trauma specialist. And that was back in 2019. that experience resulted in acute stress disorder. I was annoyed that I had acute stress disorder because I felt like, okay, I've been studying trauma for 20 years at this point. I'm a neuroscientist. I get this. And my brain is still hijacking me back into these symptoms. Luckily, I studied and learned something called havening, which I know you're well aware of, Michael. And at that point, so I had the tools and the resources to help my brain navigate through. But it was a tipping point for me where I said, I need to give my story a job. And so I started putting pen to paper and writing this story of the traumatic loss of my fiance. And initially, I thought the book would be about grief and loss. And as the story unfolded, as we know, everything that happens before plays a role in defining what's happening now in our lives and the way our brain's experiencing the world. And so I decided it had to be a memoir, but I'm never going to just write a memoir. It needed to have two jobs. So the job was, as you beautifully keyed into, I will be the case study for illuminating all of the weird things brains do. Because as an expert, I'm kind of good at it. I could separate out, like I'm having a panic story I share in the book. I'm having a panic attack on Hollywood Boulevard and I'm completely melting down after having a trauma grenade go off in my brain. And I also knew it was happening, but it didn't matter because my brain was taking over. And so that became what is now Keep Breathing.
Maybe you could share, the book starts off about the loss of your fiance, which really sets the stage for you talking about your experiences before that. Do you want to just say a few things about that to give people a flavor of the book?
Yes, happy to. So my fiance John, we were together for 10 years and we really both came from very complex childhoods. I feel like we were lucky to find each other. We were able to, at a very young age, I was 19 when we met, he was 20 and a half, support each other in healing in many respects. In hindsight, I also know that we had a very codependent relationship in that healing process. There was no self, we were each other. We were together for 10 years, and 2 years before he passed on, he started beginning to become very, very sick. This was also when the opioid epidemic was raging. And fundamentally, he became a victim of the opioid epidemic. And we had a plan after our marriage. We were going to get married, and the next day he was supposed to go into treatment. Unfortunately, he died a week before the wedding. And so we were a week late to do what needed to be done. And as a psychologist who treated addiction, it was really the survivor's guilt was so intense. The self-reflection on the enabling, the role that I played, and I talk a lot about that in the book, and of having to separate that out, because if had he been my patient, there would have been no wedding and no next the day after. The shame of his shame and his family system wouldn't have won, because there was a lot of shame that he struggled with. It would have been you're going into treatment, but because my heart was involved, it was different. And so it's been a long journey, and that was 15 years ago this month.
And I know you carry his memory even today in a new relationship, newer relationship, not a new relationship. And has the book had an impact on his family at all? I mean, since you've written the book, what are some of the things that have happened or learnings you've had? Because it must have struck so many people in deep ways, especially his family, I would imagine.
Yeah, and my family. The it took me 5 years to write this book. My first book took me 8 months, so that's some interesting context. And I love my first book, but this book, it took 5 years because of the intricacies of the interpersonal experiences that I talk about. And so for both my family and his family, it's been a pretty interesting journey to hold space and honor everybody's unique experiences. With my own family, I had the luck to be able to drop off all of those terrible first drafts and say, "Are you guys okay with this?" Or uh, "Do you mind if I talk about this in this way so I can honor their own unique stories?" My mom to this day jokes, "Well, there's the book that I get to write when she's dead. She doesn't care if dad's still alive, but I get to write it when she's dead." um, and for John's family, they had largely disowned me after John died, and not because they held me, as far as I know, responsible or accountable. I think I was a trauma trigger for their own trauma. And I taught that's Wolfeld's rule of three. It's actually a thing that's in the literature that I didn't know about when I was going through PTSD after the traumatic loss, where people just disappear. Following the book coming out, John's mom, who I hadn't spoken to in 13, 14 years, actually reached out to me and said she was really glad I shared his story, which was, when I saw the message, I didn't open it for 2.5 weeks because I was scared of what
Mhm.
it might say, even though I know in the way I wrote the book, it's so tender and it's so honoring of who he is. Um, and so it was shocking to me and such a gift to get that message from her. Healing.
Ooh, I want to focus some of the most of the conversation that I have questions about, and some of the people watching might have others on the lessons for therapists, because we could spend a lot of time on your life and what you've gone through. You talked about encephalitis. My mother had encephalitis, and it
Oh,
totally changed. She never was the same after that. So, a lot of your book touched me. But, but to focus on what therapists could learn, um, in terms of after John's sudden loss, what are your thoughts about how you help people in the immediate aftermath? I know there are EAP programs that send people right in
mm,
after a loss or after some traumatic, a bank robbery, a death, a
yeah.
suicide. And there's been some criticism of that approach, saying, it shouldn't be so fast. People need to do their own healing before that kind of intervention. I wonder if given your experience, what you think.
Mm. That's a really wonderful question. Thank you. So the in the book I write about and this is one of the scarier stories to write about an experience I had with a therapist, and I took the name out, who actually devastatingly re-traumatized me in her approach and not being trauma informed. And sharing that story was very, very scary because my goal is never to demonize anybody, especially my own field. And I feel like I hope, and you can tell me if I held space for her. um, but the idea of being trauma informed is so critical. And when we look at acute stress disorder, and we run a lot of first responders workshops that are neuroscience informed from the Brain in Crisis series, the approach of here's tools to help your system regulate. Here's tools to support your mind and your body in returning to homeostasis, because we do have the experience of what's known as what I call stress hangover after an acute stressor or an acute traumatic experience. The but we don't want to just kind of flash people into the re-experience of what their brain just went through because of the likelihood of re-traumatization. Grief specifically has its own unique journey, and it's long and arduous, and it's weird. Grief is so weird. Unfortunately, in our educational system as clinicians, we don't get a lot of education around grief, and especially traumatic grief. And so when somebody's experienced a loss, we tend to approach it like it is an acute stressor or PTSD, a traumatic event. And it's not necessarily that. Grief and loss are part of the human experience, and our system is designed naturally to be able to process through it. So that when somebody's in the acute phases, it's about stabilization, it's about compassion, stability, recognizing that if somebody's feeling numb, there's actually Dr. Mary Frances O'Connor has a construct she calls benumbed, which is a dissociative state. And it's like the brain wraps, a lovely fluffy pillow around the brain or around itself and says, hey, we're just not going to feel things right now because the grief is so intense. And that's actually, that brain fog is the brain processing. It's not dissociation. It's not unhealthy, but clinicians and certainly humanity doesn't know this. So in the acute aftermath, I believe it's about stabilization. It's not about going back into the reliving of what happened, and certainly not telling the story, because telling the story is the reliving, unless the individual says, hey, I need to tell this story. I need to have the narrative make sense for me. And even then, it's an inquiry to create a sense of balance and teaching the tools ahead of time. Like some of the tools we'll be teaching in the workshops that we're doing coming up here, of how to help the brain balance itself before going into that really intense content of loss. That's a long-winded answer.
No, the book is called Keep Breathing. And you go from your life experiences to your discovery of havening. Havening, and you weren't trained in havening as a psychologist. You had some EMDR background. And then after you'd been through so much, you discovered havening. So I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and what havening is for people who don't know havening.
Yeah. So for, contextually, I started working in rat labs when I was 19 years old, studying fear learning paradigms. That's my level of geekery. I studied EMDR under Andrew Leeds in 2024 and was okay. As Bessel used to say back then, you wag the magic wagging the fingers in front of people's eyes. That's why I'm doing that, because that's what he used to do. Hey, you're just going to wag your fingers in front of people's eyes and it won't work. And we're like, okay, well, it does work. And the idea of utilizing touch, which is what havening anchors into, is gentle, mindful touch to create long-term change. As a scientist, for me, and somebody who's trained in psychotherapy, touch is not a part of the therapeutic process, was so bizarre. But after living with very severe PTSD for 5 years, when a colleague of mine mentioned this modality where you rub your arm, give yourself a moving hug, and sing some songs and do different protocols to heal trauma, I was desperate. And that's in a very high level way what havening is. That's actually the event havening protocol, is using distractions plus mindful touch to depotentiate neurons that are encoded in the amygdala. It's a science thing that happens. And it's incredibly effective. So after 5 years of living in very severe PTSD, and I write about this in the book, the guy I was dating casually, who I'm now married to, at the time, saying, well, I've got miles and I can set you up with a hotel room. Do you want to go to New York to try this thing? I was like, oh, I guess the universe is telling me something. And so I went to my first havening training, and it was transformative. I tried EMDR to work with the trauma of the loss, and it softened it, but it didn't heal it. I never anticipated that there was the possibility that there could be something that so directly depotentiates or turns off the encoded neurons in our amygdala that are causing the trauma symptoms. And for many of us who live with PTSD, it's like there's something that's just super glued onto our brain. And it's like, if we just get that one thing to go away, if we just turn off that light switch, we can get our brain back. And I couldn't figure out how to turn that light switch off, no matter how much therapeutic work I did. And then this weird thing, havening, when haven is a safe place, which is why it's called that, gave me my brain back. And now I'm one of the co-developers, and I've been part, that was 10 years ago. And so it's been a profound journey. And my job now, I'm the chief science advisor as well. So I keep up to date with all the neuroscience to build out, like, this is why it works, which makes my heart sing, because I've lived in really severe trauma, and I've also witnessed incredible experiences with my clients utilizing these tools. And that's what healing in your hands is all about, is they can also do the work themselves, which is, don't we all need that.
wonder if you could share some anecdotes, to give us a flavor, some of your clients, um, that I'm sure what they bring in to the room, not different from what people on the screen deal with every day, but some anecdotes of how you use havening in ways that even surprised you, and what it might have looked like if we were a little birdie in the room.
Well, can I share a personal anecdote? Because this was one of the
Sure,
ones that
definitely.
just completely blew me away. So when I had the experience with the client, and it would, for context, that was, we had helicopters, full SWAT team, at when the client came into the office to assault me. It was no small joke. Literally had a clinician on the roof with a patient because she scaled onto the roof in order to keep that patient safe. Like this was a really big deal. And every single one of my clinicians, I have a team in Los Angeles and Pasadena, had patients in their office except for one who took my office manager into a room and barricaded her in that room. Every single one of them started applying the Havening touch. And throughout the course of the situation as it was unfolding, continued to haven with their client. When the situation was contained, I reached out to every single one of those clients as well as my team and said, no matter how long you need it, I will cover the cost of your therapeutic care for this, for however long you need it. No questions asked. Not a single one of them took me up on it. Every single one of those clients came back into the office, no trauma response. Now, I was having a pretty big trauma response. None of them were, none of my team members were, because they havened throughout the entire incident. To the idea of the first responders, that was deeply profound to me. And even one of them, literally the one who ended up on the roof with my clinician, wrote me an email later saying, I've never had somebody create a safe space for me in a moment of chronic stress like that. And they're literally sitting on the roof applying these techniques with helicopters overhead. You can't make that up. I mean, it was just so profound. And then a week later, one of my clinicians came to me and said, "Hey, Kate," and I was struggling with very severe acute stress disorder. I said, "Hey, can we just sit down and do a little bit of content-free work here because I can tell you're not okay." And so me being a scientist, I have a neurofeedback lab in my clinic. And so I was like, yeah, okay, sure. If we're going to do it, let's put a QEEG band on my head and let's do some brain mapping while we do this. So we were able to track my brain waves while she did the havening work with me. And we could actually watch my brain changing as we were moving through this very intense acute stressor. Incredible. And
Are
so, I
there
mean, and
any
that's just a real world case study of,
real world testing? Are
yeah.
there any counterindications? It sounds like there aren't contraindications for using this with almost anyone. When are there people you would not, or situations you would not use it with? And how soon when you meet someone for an assessment for the first time, you begin the havening process?
Yeah, wonderful question. So there's different types of protocols. We have the Healing in Your Hands programs, which is what the book's based on. Those protocols we start teaching right off the bat. They're available. I'm very shareware. My goal is to bring mental health to humanity because therapy is a privilege. Mental health is a human right. And so those fundamental protocols are trauma informed and developed for people to begin using in their day-to-day lives immediately. The clinical protocols, we do have a very clear structured setup for how to safely begin to integrate the clinical protocols into practice. Not dissimilar from EMDR, where you have the resourcing and the model of the stages to create successful outcomes, depending on which version of EMDR you're using, of course. The main thing that we always want to be mindful of is simply scope of practice. anytime we're working with somebody who has experienced trauma, or an especially complex trauma, we need to be in our scope of practice. Because if I'm working with somebody, and I do a lot of work in suicide prevention and intervention, it's a very deep passion project of mine. And if you read the book, you'll find out why. And I am comfortable sitting with somebody in intense suicidal crisis. My nervous system does not have a reaction to that because of my own story and the almost 25 years of, well, I started volunteering at suicide hotlines when I was 14 years old. So I have a lot of that's 30 years of experience sitting in that type of environment. Well, I will do havening in that space with a protocol that my team has developed specific for a suicidal crisis. Somebody who is not comfortable sitting in that environment or who has their own unprocessed trauma, their nervous system will have a reaction. And that will disrupt the havening process because a huge part of the work, a haven is a safe place. And as humans, we are co-created to be in partnership. And so if somebody's nervous system is whoop, that will impact the client, which then is the counterindication to the success of the modality. And that's true for any modality. And so it's really about the self-assessment of our own psychological safety and comfort in working with the client, first and foremost.
Are there any misconceptions about the role of breathing in psychological therapy?
Mm,
Uh,
yeah, one or
it's,
two.
I don't know many therapists. Certainly, when I went to school, wasn't that was a long time ago in the dark ages, but I know how many people are trained even recently on the important breathing, noticing breathing, what to do about breathing. So please
Yeah.
tell us
Yeah.
about that.
Yeah. And it's interesting when I titled the book Keep Breathing, everybody's like, oh, this is a breathwork book. I'm like, oh no, as Frank Anderson said, it's a thriller. It's not that. And one of the things that everybody I've just had lovingly reflected back to me so many times as people have read it is they get to a certain point and they close the book and they read the cover and they go, oh yeah, keep breathing. And they'll just breathe. Or they'll see it sitting on their desk as a loving reminder. And in a stressful moment, just seeing that message, they'll just like keep breathing. And you know, many years ago, I was speaking with Ariel Schwartz, who I know is one of your wonderful speakers as well. And we were talking about the unknown elements of breath work for trauma survivors. There's something called relaxation induced anxiety, which basically means when somebody starts to feel calm or relaxed, the amygdala jumps into a hypervigilant state. And so relaxation becomes an activating force for a trauma response. That, again, not something that's really talked about or taught. The reason for that is if we've been in a state of chronic hypervigilance or stress, and especially if we've grown up in that environment, our body has rewired itself to be in that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn state. Breath work can start to reset that state in a way that our brain isn't ready for, which can cause an unexpected trauma reaction unless we know how to move through it or have additional tools. And that's where, if anybody here follows Ariel or has read her most recent book, she brings a lot of the self-havening work into her newest book, her newest polyvagal book, because it's down regulating the brain while the breath work is down regulating the heart and the lungs and the biology. So we have neurobiology, and it becomes a partnership in down regulation. But that piece of information is so important because I myself struggled to mindfulness meditation calm, which anybody looks at my YouTube channel, you'd never guess that given how many guided meditations I have up there. But my own little squirrel brain was always used to looking out. And so calm can feel scary for a lot of survivors. And breath work, therefore, can shift us into a state of a trauma reaction counterintuitively. Strange.
I have one more question because I want to open it up to people who are watching this who might be writing Emily questions. Emily, do we have some questions? Because I want to ask one more question to you, which I've asked to other people about the future of psychotherapy. When you look at what's happening now, Ariel's work, your work, the recognition of mind, body, which and you know um, all the changes that have gone through in the psychotherapy world, I can think of in the last 50 years and longer than that,
Mhm.
and what the future might look like in terms of what we're learning from science, the impact of AI, the impact of a world that's growing increasingly anxious for all the reasons that we know, whether it's climate change or iPhones or whatever it is. Tell
Yeah.
us about where you think the psychotherapy world is going.
I think AI is a huge topic, as we know, and I know you have some wonderful workshops that I'm sure are available on demand, knowing leading edge. Um, I think there's an unexpected gift in the unfolding of AI that is actually creating a greater space for people to be more interested in the integration of neuroscience into the space of mental health, which is my really deep passion. Is people are now being, whether they want to or not, forced to be innovators in some respects, to get out of the traditional box. A lot of the conversations I'm very blessed to have with incredible experts in the field, and I feel like so often I'm having these conversations, people like yourself included, where I'm just like, I can't believe I'm talking to this person. Wow. And we're now moving away from what, and I'd love to hear your opinion on this, Michael, what historically has been a highly political version of psychotherapy. You are cognitive behavioral therapy, you are a psychoanalyst, you are you are your object relations, you're this, you're that, or the other. And there is a much greater openness to the real reality of the demand for integration. The integration allows us to be trauma informed and client centered. And we also know, I was reading an article yesterday actually, that in age group 18 to 23, a third of individuals in that age group are struggling with mental health concerns. And there's actually a term I'd never heard of called common mental health disorders now. It's like, oh, wow, that's bad. If we have a common mental health disorder that Forbes is writing about, that's bad news bears. And in that same age group, a fifth of those individuals are neither in a space of education or working. What does that mean for us in a global world? And how do we as psychotherapists find a way to partner with this whole new generation that utilizes, to your point, social media, that is used to screens, that is used to this very different reality from what so many of us grew up within. I was a latchkey streetlight baby, streetlights come on, you go home. So mom may know where we are for lunch, maybe not. I grew up in Kansas, like just got on your bike and you disappeared. Sometimes, mostly you went to school, hopefully.
Mhm.
Just it's a very different reality, and all of these changing dynamics are going to force us as therapists to be open, to be innovative. And I think first and foremost, to really look at how do we integrate all of the tools.
You know, you Yeah, I think these silos started breaking down years ago. I'll tell you when I noticed it. We had a session which had Pat Ogden and a very prominent psychoanalyst. I think his name was Bromberg in New York. This was maybe 20 years ago.
Wow.
And each of them were loving each other's work. Pat Ogden talked about having clients walk around the room, and you think a psychoanalyst who usually sees people lying on a couch would just be at different ends of the spectrum or the
Uh-huh.
continuum, but they were saying, "Oh, I really appreciate your work, whatever." And I think what I realized then
Yeah.
was that things are breaking down. No, very few people say, "I'm a this kind of therapist." They say, "Well, I learned this, I do a little of that, I'm taking for this, I'm taking a course in
Yeah.
that," because most people realize that there's lots to learn and sticking to one strict mode is not the most helpful thing for clients, and that's what people are here to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's even in my educational journey, there was like still that silo experience. And in Los Angeles, we have a huge psychoanalytic community. And it's so interesting to see them slowly opening up the doors to other concepts. And personally, one of the things that gives me a little tongue-in-cheek chuckle, but also annoyance, is how much about the brain are we really taught in graduate school in our educational programs? And I know a lot because I went to the medical school and I took a bunch of courses because I'm a geek and I was also trying to figure out why was my brain being so weird and wanted to
Mhm.
make sense of it. And the opportunity of brain partnership and neuroplasticity is huge. And that's a big reason why I wrote Keep Breathing is illuminating why our brain is doing these brainy things so that the shame doesn't have the space to topple us and take over because it's like, oh, it's our brain fighting for us in this weird way, which is why I'm an applied neuroscientist, which means I'm a translator of neuroscience into our more common rhetoric and language. But I think that that's my deep passion project is what if we just can start to talk about the brain? And now Amy the amygdala, which is something I came up with 25 years ago, people are talking about Amy, and it's so
Amy,
cool to see that and just be like, yes, Amy, yeah,
Amy,
we've got this brain part who loves you, and she can be wacky. That's okay.
okay, I have lots more questions, but I'm going to open up to see if anyone out there. Emily, come on the screen and let us know if we have some questions.
Um, I'm not seeing any in the chat. Of course, if anyone wants to raise their hand, their virtual hand, so they can chat with Kate and Mike, I'm sure we'd love to see you. There's been so much information so far. I'm
Okay, well,
sure
I'll
people
go
are
on,
still
and then
processing.
if you'd like to ask a question, either write in the chat or you can use the raise hand. Oh,
Oh,
there's a
yeah.
raised hand from
Hello,
Susie.
Susie.
Hi,
Hello.
Susie.
Uh, Hello, turning on my video. Um, Thought I was, yes, I am. I was interested in when you talked about relaxation induced anxiety, and I was wondering, I don't know if this is the forum, if you have any, if you can speak to how do you get around that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I'm just curious, people would put in the chat, how many of you have heard that term before? Or is it pretty new? Yeah, it's
Not
new.
me.
Yeah. Well, Emily, of course you have. So that is where I really do see the intersection of and one of the powerful opportunities of the havening touch with breath work and integrating those experiences. Uh, so that the way the havening touch works, just for some quick context, is we have little fibers in our skin. And if anybody here has ever walked into a coffee table and then immediately bent down and rubbed your shin or your knee or whatever it was where you got knocked, the reason you did that automatic behavior is because of these little C-tactile fibers in your skin that actually reduce pain. And the way they do that is they go up to a sequence of areas in the brain. If you want to get really geeky, go to my YouTube channel, buy the books that walks through this. And they reduce the impact of the pain receptors in a moment of shock. What the founders of the havening techniques, the Rudins, began to identify, and they didn't know about the C-tactile fibers. That was one of my contributions to the work, but they started to realize that the use of mindful touch downregulates the brain and fundamentally the amygdala. So when we're in any state of an anxiety response, trauma response, even depression, because our amygdala is very involved in depression, any type of survival reaction, our amygdala goes into a hyper reactive state. And so if we start the red brain state, there's a lot of Daniel Siegel talks about that, Rick Hansen there's a lot of different people who talk about that in different ways. A huge part of that is the amygdala being hyperactive. And in relaxation induced anxiety, that's where our brain goes, I'm not safe anymore because I am no longer vigilant or hypervigilant. I'm no longer dukes up on guard, which means that if there's a predator in the environment, real or perceived, I could be hurt. The self-havening touch down regulates the amygdala through engaging those fibers. And the touch is palm on palm, a nice moving hug, and repeating the motion across the eyebrows or underneath the cheeks, which fundamentally increases the presence of slow wave brain waves in our brain, which we like. And that's what the bilateral stimulation with tapping or an EMDR does. Same thing, which allows the amygdala to start to create a new relationship with the experience of calm. And then we can bring in different breath exercises, square breathing, mountain breathing. The side breath is one of my absolute favorites, to have a partnership with the downregulation of the amygdala while changing how the brain is perceiving the experience of breath and having that much oxygen available. Which again sounds counterintuitive because oxygen is, we got to breathe to stay alive. And so it's interesting that breath work in of itself can create a survival response. So in the workshops we have coming up in the fall that I'm doing with Michael and Emily, we'll be learning some of these techniques for trauma treatment as well as pain and chronic illness treatment, which is another area of my specialization. And also if you go on, thank you. And Emily just put one in the chat box. On my YouTube channel, there's a bunch of different videos about this as well as guided exercises. And if you go to drkatetruitt.com, you can download some exercises too. We have a healing toolkit for how to work with this.
Can I add a little extra to that question?
Yeah.
It sounds like it's a little like desensitization with phobias, where you have to, and you can't do it too quickly or you re-traumatize. Like you've got to get the key is getting the actual feeling calm before you try the thing.
Yeah, it's distress tolerance. So one of the big goals that we're always working with our clients is we have to feel all the feels. How many of our clients come and say, I just want to be happy? It's like, no, nobody's brain is designed to do that. And a joke I can make, because I am a widow from the opioid epidemic, it's like that is opioids, that's heroin. Not that my fiance did heroin, but that's basically when somebody's in that opioid drive, that's the system going, I have to be happy, I have to be feeling good all the time. And our system is not designed for that. Instead, it's about feeling all the feels and helping the amygdala learn that all of the emotions are important and that certain emotions do not need to have priority processing, such as anxiety, fear, rage, depression, which there's a very specific type, I'm going to get geeky here for a minute, type of neuroplasticity called stress-induced structural plasticity that is designed to take our brain into all of those hard feeling states and build super freeways out of them, which means our amygdala and the rest of our brain prioritizes those feeling states, and relaxation-induced anxiety is a big part of that. That's a wonderful conceptualization. And we have a tool called CPR for the amygdala, which is creating personal resilience for the amygdala. And we have an entire playlist on YouTube that is all about that desensitization, the building of distress tolerance, while actually teaching people how to proactively heal their own trauma triggers, which is pretty cool. And that's what my team was fundamentally doing in that moment when we had SWAT and the helicopters, is they were doing CPR for the amygdala with the clients, and as clinicians receiving the benefit of that, because we have mirror neurons. If I sat here and applied the havening touch and all of you watched, your brains would start to become downregulated. Now, for some of you, you might go into relaxation-induced anxiety response if we didn't give your brains another job to refocus it. For others, you might just go, oh, I'm just going to take a nice nap. I guess it's lunchtime. We can do that. Yeah, the brains are cool. They're really cool.
Emily, I think there was a question or a comment in the chat, honey.
Yeah, this is way too technical in lay terms. Yes. So my fiance, thank you, Amy. I know I geek out. So thank you for taking me down here. So my fiance was very sick. He had at the time what was an orphan, known as an orphan disease. Nobody knew what it was. It was a medical abnormality. What we think we can figure out from his symptom clusters in hindsight after he passed and from the autopsy was that he had rheumatoid arthritis. And it was eating away. It was very severe, and it was eating away his joints and all of his cartilage. And he'd been living with it for a very long time. And devastatingly, as they gave him painkillers for it, that made it worse. And fundamentally, he died of an accidental overdose of opioids and benzos that were all given to him. The idea that we had, the plan we had in place, and I go into this in a much more kind of achingly tender way in the story, because this is a very, very high level simplification of the journey of these years, was because of his intense shame. He came from a very complex family history. He didn't want my family to know he was struggling. He didn't want his family to know he was struggling. So for 2 years, he and I were on an island while he was slowly becoming very, very addicted to all of these painkillers, which is a very real reality for millions of Americans, especially coming out of the opioid epidemic and during it. And it's still ongoing, as we know. And I told him we would cancel the wedding. We had a big fight. This is a really poignant story in the book, so I won't, for anybody who wants to buy the book and read it, I won't pull that back. But I finally got him to agree that I would still, and this was how intense his shame was, I was still going to get on the plane to go to our honeymoon after we dropped him off at treatment, so nobody would be wiser to what was actually happening. And I went out one night. He was supposed to be with his brother that night. We started quietly setting up kind of babysitting because we knew the situation and we know how addiction is. His brother was unavailable at the last minute, and I was out with all of his sisters for welcome to the family dinner. And he didn't pick up when he was supposed to when I called for him to pick me up, and he died that night. And I found him, and I couldn't save his life. And that basically turned our wedding into his funeral. So we had every life's, we were just, we were a week too late.
Thank you for sharing. We do have another question, an audience question from Susan Howard. Hi, Sue.
Hi, Emily. So my question is, I work with the perinatal population, and I'm wondering if you use the havening approach for labor, birth trauma, anything sort of around that, because I'm having a lot of clients many clients coming with severe birth trauma.
Yes, I have done work in that space, and we have an incredible RN midwife who has launched perinatal havening.
Oh,
Who specializes specifically in this. Her name is Kim Sun, and she is absolutely brilliant. And she has a specific training for the perinatal space that is absolutely brilliant, and work because you're navigating multiple levels of hormone and chemical considerations there that are outside of the traditional mind body space, whether traumatized or not. It's absolutely brilliant. Perinatal havening. You just
okay.
plug that in, you'll get her trainings. She's amazing.
Thank you so much. That's amazing. Thank
Yeah,
you.
it's phenomenal. And Amy, I saw your question here about Chinese medicine and holistic care. We did. And in the book, I actually talk about, as Michael mentioned, shortly after my fiance died, I was in a car accident where somebody ran a red light and hit me head on. And it was a devastating car accident. And yeah, it's a 10-car pileup. And I acquired encephalitis, which is a very, very severe brain virus. And for 18 months, battled for my life with the encephalitis in the throes of also the traumatic loss and the grief and PTSD. And one of the things that actually did save my life coming out of the Western medicine space and their basically stabilization, but we can't really help you, was holistic health and Chinese medicine, which I do believe was a huge part of why I was open to the idea of mindful touch to create healing when somebody who I also deeply respected and trusted, a clinical social worker from New York, said, hey, there's this thing where you do this and you do things, cognitive protocols. But holistic care is so critical, and we cannot divorce, to the point of Michael's earlier point. The integration is so important. The mind and body system it's a closed loop. What happens here impacts here, what impacts here impacts here. And so it's whatever, that's client-centered care, I believe. We tried with John to just, at that point, I think the addiction was too severe and too deep, which is a huge part of why I wanted to tell this story, because the impact of surviving that, of living within it, not just as a caregiver of somebody who's chronically ill, but also living in the chaos of somebody who's addicted. As even somebody who's an expert in the field, none of that mattered, because we're human. Sometimes what we know doesn't matter.
Thank you. I'm not seeing a specific
I think there was
question.
another question in there, Emily.
Oh, it was who's Kate's publisher. I was just gonna put that in the chat.
Oh, okay. And in terms of doing your work, many people are working online,
Yeah.
virtually, whatever it's called. Um, much of the surprise of many therapists at the beginning of COVID said, I never work online. Now a lot of people are working online. It looks to me that what you're teaching can be easily taught online. Do you see a difference between having someone in your office and someone on a screen?
One of the biggest surprises of the pandemic, so we do, on my team, we have people who are trained in the entire alphabet soup of trauma care. All the psychosensory techniques, havening, EMDR, brain spotting, all the somatic work, IFS, art therapists, functional medicine. So we've got a pretty robust integration of all of these different experts. And everybody, because of, I guess, my bias with havening, at minimum learns the Healing in Your Hands programs. When everybody went home in March of 2020, which, we shut our doors pretty early as soon as LA announced the state of emergency. We were wondering what would happen in terms of our ability to do trauma reprocessing and trauma work. We've been utilizing havening in a way that is called facilitated havening, which means we're applying the touch, much like if you've done EMDR and you're tapping on your client's knees, very similar to that, or old school EMDR with that. Remember getting the tennis shoulder from the EMDR? So fun. And so we're like, well, is this going to work? And all of our clients went home, and what we started to see is their outcomes actually started to get better, because they were building the muscle memory of the application of the havening touch in the same environment that they lived and worked in. Now, there was other complications to that, of course, but same state learning is very real. And so they started utilizing havening more and more and more in their day-to-day environment. And their ability to do the trauma work got stronger, because they were now the agent of their own change. There was no dependency on us. They were fundamentally healing themselves, which was incredible. Now we are back in person and virtual and there are a lot of benefits and we're noticing more and more clients calling in for in person, which I think a lot of people are screen burned. They're done. But even then, we have everybody do self-havening, and we have continued to ensure that everybody is their agent for change. I mean, it seems like such a easy thing to think about, But I know in my own training, so much of it was, well, I'm supposed to be the expert who's doing the thing. And now it's really a clear partnership of I'm teaching you how to do your own healing work with the idea that as you work and grow, I'm going to fade away because you have your entire toolkit. So it's been pretty amazing to watch how this integrates so readily and inspires people to really just take those moments to take care of their mind and their body in a whole new way. If
All
anybody
right.
hasn't tried it, I do recommend checking out one of the YouTube videos, and they're just kind of just trying it on because it sounds kind of weird, but it works.
Well, if someone is new to this, can they look at one of those videos on YouTube, I would imagine, or on your website?
Yeah.
And could they say, no, I haven't had any training in this, but I would like to try something with you right now, and just with a client in a first or second session,
Hmm.
do one or two of the practices. Would you suggest that?
Yeah, the CPR for the amygdala and I believe Emily put this one in the text in the chat box already, the sigh breath with havening touch. So sigh, like you sigh, but it's a very specific breathing protocol that came out of UCLA and Andrew Huberman at Stanford. I would say that's the best starting point, as it is such a very simple exercise to do very readily. Before bringing anything into session, of course, I always say, try it yourself, please. Because also your brain will like you better for it. But from there, there's all sorts of guided meditations that we then integrate the havening touch into. So, but the entire YouTube channel is designed in a trauma-informed way. So it's built for, and we get hundreds of comments of just people being like, that was amazing, or I felt calm for the first time in a decade. And it's like, that's really cool. But I mean, to the point of real world examples, when the war in Ukraine broke out, I reached out to everybody I knew over there and said, hey, we're doing a training for you, come for free. And so we did one of the official havening trainings, and we had people who were literally sitting in bomb shelters attending the training as they're in the breakout groups, utilizing the havening protocols, who would come back into the large group setting and share that they were regulated and balanced, and they hadn't been for months. And it's like, wow, profound. And it sounds too good to be true. I know, I get it, but it's pretty profound. Brain partnership.
Um, okay, we're just about out of time, so I think I'm gonna say big thank you. Not only for this book, and of course for being here today, and all you bring to the world of people and psychotherapy, um, which is so useful and practical. And you're doing a real great service to everyone. So I think I'm seeing some messages in the chat line, but I think I can say on behalf of everyone who's watching this and who'll watch it later, a big thank you for what you do and who you are and what you bring. Thank you.
Right back at you.